The way I think about it is that the grid has always been designed for large generators, and small loads are added over time slowly, right? And now we're adding large loads very quickly that use power 24/7 and that also have like pretty rapidly depreciating assets as well. What I look for is around our folks making sure that they're kind of incorporating that uncertainty, innovating around tariffs, contracts, call it the human element of the equation. As we know, things move slowly in the electric sector, especially on the utility side, and I think we're seeing some innovation there.
That's Kush Patel. He's a senior partner at E3, Energy and Environmental Economics. It's a North American consultancy that does a lot of public sector work in the electricity markets. What he's talking about is real-time problem solving for the planning period of the here and now. Within the next 5 years, power supply is going to remain tight, as we'll discuss. Taking stock of this moment is what today's conversation is all about. Hello, I'm Terry Vishwanath, the energy economist at CoBank, and your co-host of Power Plays. As always, I'm joined by my colleague and co-host, Tamara Reynolds. She's a managing director here at CoBank. Hello, Tamara.
Hey, Terry. Following up on the conversation we had back in December with S&P Global on rising costs, and then more recently with the Department of Energy's Lawrence Berkeley Labs on their expectations of data center growth, we wanted to better understand how other consumers might be impacted by these fast-emerging megaloads and rising costs, and really, how to prepare for the toughest planning cycle ahead. Here's our conversation with Kush. Kush, the reason Terry and I wanted to have a good conversation with you today were really about two important reports that you guys released last year. The most recent one, of course, discusses the customer impact of data center load growth, and the other was a discussion that focused around the long-term viability of building infrastructure for these large load customers. So that's kind of where we wanted to start the conversation. But let's start off with maybe a discussion around some of the work that you did for the Virginia Joint Legislative Audit and Review Commission around the customer implications of data center load.
Yeah, happy to kind of speak to the report and the analysis. And I think that's pretty interesting, just given that Virginia is the world's #1 data center market. Our study specifically looked at both Dominion, the investor-owned utility, as well as some of the public utilities there, Novak and Mecklenburg. And one of the kind of interesting takeaways from that analysis is that it was really focused on constrained demand growth. For most of the audience, that's probably fairly intuitive, but I think for all the folks out there who are kind of not really paying attention or even think about power markets or electricity, I think that was a pretty powerful concept that was established during the study that there is a limit to the amount you can interconnect per year. And you can see that in the report that I think the maximum that was ever added from a generation perspective in Virginia was like 2.2 gigawatts per year. And the higher kind of large load cases, we're looking at north of 3 gigawatts per year for the next 15 to 20 years. And that is just a totally different mindset, infrastructure investment that's needed, not just in any single year, but continuously. So I think that was really kind of eye-opening for some folks and stakeholders to be able to kind of see that quantification at that level. A really important finding was that data centers to date hadn't really impacted other customer classes, so there hadn't been any cost shifts or subsidization. And I think intuitively that makes sense. Folks are designing rates and allocating costs appropriately. But again, you had to kind of do the analysis and the work to kind of show that math. And I think we did that in the study. But I think that the other kind of important secondary conclusion to that was that, yes, historically, there's been no kind of issues with subsidization. And if anything, there has been, kind of a benefit for lots of reasons. But then going forward, you're going to have a much different environment where there's no kind of low-hanging fruit. You have to build all this new infrastructure. Much of that infrastructure is going to be more expensive than kind of the existing infrastructure that's a little bit older, depreciated, et cetera, lower cost. And then, what do you do in that environment where growth is imposing costs, not just on the folks that are kind of causing that growth, but also for other customers. And I think that's the debate that's happening in Virginia right now is around balancing those two different things of supporting the industry, deciding on what is a reasonable level of growth, and then, how do you protect other ratepayers or hold them harmless if that's the goal. I think the third piece of it as well was that we really looked into the clean energy policies of the state. And again, no one had put all those three pieces together of what do you need to do to accommodate different levels of data center growth? What does that mean for other customers? And then, how do we square that with our clean energy policy? So we ran lots of cases that looked at policy without and with it. And then another kind of interesting finding was that the policy, while very important in the long term, 15, 20 years, in the short term, it's not as important just because you're just constrained on what you can build.
From a build-out perspective, how do you support some of these things? And how efficient can data centers become, right? When you think about technology changes on their side. in particular, the news about the Chinese AI technology DeepSeek that came out last week that was really forcing the idea of greater efficiency when you think about the capacity to run. When you think about that kind of development, and when you think about this other report that you guys referenced and put out, low growth is here to stay, but our data centers. Let's talk about the development of those and how you guys are thinking about efficiency disruptions that may happen as we continue to sort of make the data center side more efficient overall, and what the long-term trajectory is.
From our perspective, it was really important just to introduce the concept that like there could be very big efficiency gains, especially if power constraints are real. You can only interconnect so much. That's going to be a powerful incentive for all of these companies to be able to reduce energy usage, to be more efficient, outside of just the economics of trying to have a cheaper, better product. And I think just kind of understanding that everyone's operating under a pretty high level of uncertainty is pretty important. I think that's okay. You can still make good decisions under uncertainty, but the problem is going to be if you're just waiting for more certainty, I think you might be waiting for a long time because it's going to be up and down, more usage, less usage, more efficient, plateau efficiency. So I think that's just something that's probably here to stay, at least for a while. And I think from our perspective, you just want to make sure you're running enough scenario sensitivities where you're trying to capture potentially the future states of the world where, what happens if every data center is twice as efficient over time? Does that really meaningfully change a forecast and your decisions that you're making in the next 3 to 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, depending on your planning horizon?
So a lot of uncertainty, but I think the one point that really was brought home, especially in this study in Virginia, is back to your point, 2.2 gigawatts of supply. That's what we can bring on. And we're looking at demand that is growing in excess of that, 3 gigawatts of demand annually for as far as the eye can see. So one of the challenges not having enough power supply or maybe the right quality of power supply. And also just it's a very different paradigm. So when we think about that large build out that occurred post-war development, large build out in the 1980s perhaps, it was a very different marketplace. And we have a lot more constraints in terms of what, how, and where we build. So I'd like to just hear a little bit more. So one is the power supply story. Understanding the renewables development we had was largely on the back of being able to develop a transmission to get the supply to where we need to get it. This is a very different marketplace. So talk to us a little bit about the power supply situation and, kind of the signposts on how development might unfold ahead.
Yeah, the era of things being kind of cheap and easy, unfortunately, seems behind us. The scale that we're talking about, not just in Virginia, but in various markets, really rivals and surpasses post-World War II developments. It's like the BPA or TVA, just giant federal initiatives to bring tens of gigawatts of resources online to supply millions of customers and industry across the US. And that's the level that we're talking about and more. With low growth percentage points we haven't seen in many decades. But then, we're a much bigger system, many more people. The quantum is more than we've ever done before, actually. Even if the growth percentage is similar to what we saw in the 60s and 70s and 80s, just like the sheer number of megawatts that we're talking about have just never been done before. So I think that's a challenge. And I think we're, in some ways, it's really causing strain across the US with our existing power system, with our existing kind of structures. Markets, regulators were never designed to manage, 2-3 gigawatts a year of new load and new resources continuously. That's not what things are designed for. So this is something that we said in our white paper that, that's a big traffic jam and you're going to, maybe exacerbate issues that have been present, but not really known or really impactful because it hadn't seen this kind of growth before. It is driving a lot of innovation and reform. It's just like most things in life, transitions are pretty messy. And, we're kind of right in the middle of it now. And hopefully then when we have successive waves of load growth or more things, then we've gone through this. So hopefully the next round or 2 or 3 will be a little bit easier. But I do think to the kind of question around, do we have the right power supply? Do we have the right things? I mean, it's going to be kind of all of the above. I think Virginia is a bit unique just given its size and importance in the data center world. But most markets are going to be trending toward more growth over time for various reasons. And then transmission is always going to be difficult to do, but you're going to do that. Building new renewables onshore, will have its own challenges. Offshore has its challenges. Building new gas pipeline capacity and getting new turbines also have challenges. So I think there's not going to be kind of a simple answer to any of these. It's going to be kind of a mix. As always, we're a regional electricity system, and each kind of region will have its own particular kind of mix of resources, but it's not going to be a silver bullet with any one particular type of technology. So I would kind of encourage the listeners and everybody else to kind of just keep an open mind of, what is really possible in the next several years, especially. And then that kind of limits your choices to some extent, but also it allows you to think a little bit more creatively as well.
There's some interesting developments that probably are worth discussing. The first one is the possibility that PJM might allow non-intermittent projects to jump the queue. The other is the recent announcement by NextEra on their focus on natural gas-fired and nuclear power, as you just mentioned, the importance of that. Help us kind of figure out how this might change the next build cycle in the US and what are people thinking about?
Yeah, great data points, something that we follow quite a bit and very much in line with our Virginia study where you kind of build a lot of renewables, storage, but you also have to build a little bit of gas to make sure you maintain reliability and to be able to meet the energy needs. So I think that's very much in line with our analysis that we've done both in Virginia and elsewhere. I think it becomes a really kind of interesting question around how each market kind of wants to be able to manage kind of the affordability, reliability kind of questions, right? Which is always very important as well as cost. And I don't think there's going to be a way where you can just build one single type of resource. I hate to use the term like all of the above, but it's pretty clear that is pretty much all of the above, especially when there's constraints on nuke deployment, things like that, and also the costs, right? Like NextEra and their investor relations report basically said you have kind of wind and solar and storage being the lowest cost kind of energy and capacity resource, with gas, kind of filling in the gap in the next several years. And then post 2030, post 2035, you may start talking about kind of newer technologies like SMRs and other things that are kind of being developed and lots of kind of technology and resources are being deployed. So I personally largely agree with that. I think there's only so much you can do in the next 1 to 2 years. Again, like PGM trying to think about ways where you can fast track some certain projects. There's lots of controversy with that kind of proposal, but ultimately, you're trying to kind of solve your kind of near-term problem. And then there's lots of focus on kind of the post 2035 world, I would say, like where we have all these new and exciting technologies that can kind of hopefully scale at affordable prices. But there's really that messy middle in the next 10 years where maybe there's not as much focus for obvious reasons because it is very difficult. And I think, that I call the donut hole or the next 10 years where it gets very difficult, potentially call it 2025 to 2035. That's where you start talking about kind of the art of the possible, like what can we actually deploy? Maybe there's a utility or a set of stakeholders that really want a new gas turbine and a new, gas plant. But that's going to take 5 years to order it from the OEM, get all the technical and other specs, get the permitting for gas pipeline expansion. But then what can be built in the next year or two? That might just be renewables and storage. And that's going to be important for kind of both cost and just to be able to meet your demands. So, maybe for some of the listeners who are maybe smaller utilities, just to be aware of that context that, you might be also competing against a NextEra of the world and others who are also going out and placing these orders and doing those things. So you might want to think about kind of different technologies or different things that can be done in the next few years.
I guess the coincidence of a lot of these events occurring at the same time, right? The aging of the grid occurring at a big build cycle, a marketplace that's very tight. It is going to bring some developments we haven't had on the drawing board before. So I think super, super helpful context. You did talk about this interesting environment. It was an interesting graphic as I'm thinking about this because it's almost like the field of dreams for developers. Why are we seeing this energy cycle that likes of which we probably have not seen since post-war development?
I think the last 20 years have been not an aberration, but lots of different confluence of events that kept our load, relatively flat on a national level. Ultimately, we've been kind of flat because, we had unprecedented efficiency gains from lighting, from new stricter building codes and appliance efficiency standards, things like that. We saw, unfortunately, a lot of loss of manufacturing across the US, call it load destruction or load degrowth that occurred. And then a lot of our economy shifted to more services that required less energy. So all of those things are very big things that happen, and our load kind of stayed flat. It didn't really go down, but it didn't really grow. But that's really the only time in our history where that's happened. And I think we're in some ways returning to kind of the norm where we saw kind of growth kind of continuously. Again, there's like multiple sources of that growth. Will AI kind of continue? All the graphs are always, up and to the right. I don't trust that as a forecaster because that's not usually how life works in the real world. But that being said, there's also other things that are going on, like you mentioned, manufacturing, electric vehicles, even like electrification of like the oil and gas fields, Permian, places like that, just using electricity more and more as a source of fuel, as a source of energy. If America kind of continues to be a huge economic engine, relative to kind of our, kind of the the peers in the rest of the world, then you'll see a lot more foreign investment, lots of reasons why it still makes sense for America to kind of continue to grow our electricity sector. So, not to say it can't pause or even go back a little bit, but if you're looking at a 15, 20 year kind of cycle here. So yeah, I've heard some people call it kind of like a power super cycle. I'm not sure if I'm personally ready to kind of call that, but it does seem like we're, shifting. We've been kind of in third or second gear for a while, and we're now kind of in fourth gear. And we'll see if we kind of can get to fifth or sixth. That's the big question in my mind.
The E3 study we just discussed found that if current trends continue without any constraints on growth, demand in Virginia would more than triple relative to today's levels. Threefold growth places significant pressure on system planners' ability to build sufficient generation, transmission, and distribution infrastructure to maintain a reliable system. But the preparation we do today in terms of innovative planning will set us up for success for what Kush tells us will be the early innings for the next growth cycle.
Kush and the E3 team are really thought leaders in the industry, and I appreciate his insights. I hope all of you will catch up with us next month as we visit with San Isabel's Ryan Ellerton and Tri-State's Reggie Rudolph as they explore innovative power supply solutions, but this time at the distribution level. These two executives are thoughtful collaborators, both with each other and their broader co-op communities. I can't imagine a better duo to challenge us on thinking out of the box.
I hope you'll join us then, and goodbye for now.
CoBank's Power Plays podcast is intended for informational purposes only, and the information should not be used without CoBank's express written permission. The information provided in the podcast is not intended to be investment, tax, or legal advice and should not be relied upon by listeners for such purposes. The information contained has been compiled from what CoBank regards as reliable resources. However, CoBank does not make any representation or warranty regarding the content and disclaims any responsibility for the information, materials, third-party opinion, and data included in the podcast. In no event will CoBank be liable for any decision made or actions taken by anyone, person or persons, relying on information contained in this podcast.